welcome to the HSCSI Scholar Series event on bringing critical Filipinx studies to the high school ethnic studies classroom. We're very excited to introduce the MCC interns who will be giving us an introduction to the space.
Thank you all for coming today. My name is Amara and I'm one of the interns here at the Multicultural Community Center.
Hello, I'm Daniela. I'm also an intern at the Multicultural Community Center.
Yeah, and as part of any event that's hosted here, we like to offer a land acknowledgement as well as a space history, just to really get folks grounded in what brings us to the space, as we do, offer events for the community that are centered around our core values, which you can read over there. But yeah, the first off, we'd like to offer a land acknowledgement, and we thank the Native American Student Development for drafting the statement. We recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Borona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible this university's relationship to Native people. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold University of California, Berkeley more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. As a practice, MCC interns also like to move beyond land acknowledgements to call us into how we can materially engage in Indigenous liberation and decolonization, whether that's on Turtle Island, Palestine, the Philippines, and beyond. We ask that you all support land back and Indigenous resistance movements in any way that you can.
Yes, and also we'd like to ground ourselves with the MCC history and what brought the center to the way it is now. So the Multicultural Community Center is rooted in the legacy of the Third World Liberation Front, which was first formed at San Francisco State. In 1968, Black students led the fight for students of color at SF State to create a Black Studies department and later a Third World College, which would engage in the histories of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. The fight would spread to Berkeley in 1969, and the Third World Liberation Front would form as a coalition of Black, Native American, Asian American, and Chicano students who wanted self-determination within the academy and the Third World College. After a 3-month strike, the Department of Ethnic Studies will be created. The Third World Liberation Front returned in 1999 as the campus continued to attack the Ethnic Studies Department through funding cuts. In their list of demands, they asked for a multicultural center, and after a series of demonstrations and a week-long hunger strike, the MCC was created. As we move forward, we carry the core values of student-led anti-oppression, cross-cultural understanding and oppression, sustainability and wellness, popular education, and social justice in our continued struggles for a reimagined and liberated future. This space has a ethnic studies library, garden, resources for graduate students, free printing, a basic needs cabinet, and a snack pantry. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask the interns at the front desk. If you'd like to learn more about the MCC, please check out our Instagram MCC interns or official MCC Berkeley for our programming and weekly hours. We typically hold events surrounding our core values, which are uploaded to our calendar at mcc.berkeley.edu. Thank you.
And greetings to everyone who's in the place today at the MCC. Thank you for the interns at the MCC for sharing the land acknowledgement and also the history of this important space at UC Berkeley campus. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Jason Muniz. I'm the director of the UC Berkeley History Social Science Project, but my capacity here in this space is to support the High School Ethnic Studies Initiative. HSESI is a collaboration of 3 units at UC Berkeley campus, the History Project, also the American Culture Center, as well as the Ethnic Studies Department. And all these folks have gotten together to provide as much support and as much access to the resources at UC Berkeley as possible in advance of the high school graduation Ethnic Studies course. So any of the resources, any of the materials, any of the speakers that we're having at this series are all related to the effort of bringing as many great resources to teachers and providing great educators with great cover. So some of the work that we like to do is presented on our Ethnic Studies Hub. It's presented and instead of the many workshops that we offer, certainly during the summer. We've had a lot of great reception and a lot of great work that's being done there. But I'd also like to bring up the fact that we have a lot of great scholar panels, like the one that you're going to enjoy today. So today we're going to spend some time with a few scholars and a member of the university's undergraduates right now. At just a moment, I'm going to pass it to. But yeah, we like to share that the High School Ethnic Studies Initiative, it's a collaboration between those departments. We'd love for you to reach out to us and see what we might have to offer in your community. There's a sign up for the email list around the room via QR code, but also we'll be providing you with some information about how to learn more about future events and how to join the work and the initiative on your end and take advantage of some of these great resources. Those will be shared in the chat as well. So thank you to all the folks who are working with the American Cultures Department right now, or American Culture Center right now to support this work. I'd love to pass it on to our panelists so we can kind of get going and share what we have to do.
Thank you so much, Jason. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here on this incredibly hot day. Just one note first, some of our friends in the back, if y'all want to come closer to get a better look, I promise we don't bite, right? But yeah, so no, I'm very honored to be here with such a wonderful panel. I'm really excited for the conversation that we're about to engage in. My name is Clara Mangali. I'm an undergraduate here at UC Berkeley. I'm a senior. I am also majoring in sociology and minoring in ethnic studies. But enough about me. I'm very honored to introduce our panelists today. Some of whom you may know, some of whom have relationships to the UC Berkeley community here, but all of whom have done so much to contribute to the dialogue in our community around, how can we create education that is more affirming, that is pro-people, and that meets the needs of our community, especially those who are most marginalized. So all the way on the end here, we have Dr. Vernadette Vicuña Gonzalez. Vernadette is a professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies here at Berkeley. Her interdisciplinary humanities-based research broadly examines cultures of imperialism with a focus on the United States and its colonial territories and interventions in Asia and the Pacific. A central theme in her work is how race, indigeneity, gender, and sexuality intersect and operate, sometimes together and sometimes in opposition, in the cultural terrains of empire. Her first book, Securing Paradise, Tourism and Militarism in Hawaii and the Philippines, considers the convergences of modern military and touristic ideologies, cultures, and technologies of tourism and militarism. Securing Paradise was named the best book in cultural studies by the Association for Asian American Studies in 2015. Yeah, we can get some applause for that.
Still.
And further developing this line of inquiry in 2016, she co-edited with Jana K. Lippman and Teresa Teiwa an American Quarterly special issue on the convergences of tourism and militarism. And for those of you who don't know, Vernadette also has a new book out about BTS.
Yeah.
Which I'd love for you to mention more about later. But can we give it up for Vernadette? Next to Vernadette here, we have Dr. Michael Schulze-Oechtering Castañeda. Michael Schulze is an ethnic studies trained historian who specializes in the study of comparative relational racialization and anti-racist and decolonial social movements. The political and intellectual questions that Michael asked were nurtured during his time as a participant and later co-facilitator in the Tyree Scott Freedom School, a week-long political educational program for Seattle youth. Michael draws upon his past experiences as a youth organizer to develop a research and teaching agenda that examines how racialized subjects of U.S. empire have both questioned and crossed racial boundaries. No Separate Peace, Black and Filipinx Workers and the Labor of Solidarity in the Pacific Northwest. This study examines the parallel and overlapping activist traditions and grassroots organizing practices of Filipino cannery workers in Alaska and Black construction workers in Seattle between the 70s and early 2000s. Michael is also a member of the Critical Filipinx Studies Collective. Give it up for CFSC, woo! A collective of scholar activists that collaborates with community and grassroots organizations that embrace a progressive agenda for dignity, respect, and the empowerment of Filipino, Filipinx, and Filipinos in the Philippines, the US, and the global Filipino diaspora. We give it up for Michael. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Allison Tintiago-Cubales. Allison was born and raised here on Ohlone land with parents who were immigrants from the Philippines, from Batangas and Tarlac. She is a distinguished professor in the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University. And since 2000, she's been teaching Asian American studies, focusing on Filipino, Filipinx, and Filipino-American studies, and also courses on ethnic studies, women's studies, arts, and pedagogy. She's also interim chair of secondary education and affiliated faculty member in the educational leadership. She's currently the director of curriculum for UCLA's Foundations and Futures, Asian American and Pacific Islander multimedia textbook, which we're very excited to hear more about too. In 2024, she was honored with the Wang Family Award, one of the most prestigious honors faculty can receive in the California State University system for her teaching, service, and scholarship. Also in 2024, she became an American Educational Research Association Fellow. She was also featured in this year's Asian Women Are Strong event. She was also recently honored with the Association of Asian American Studies Mentorship Award. Allison's work really shines through in her mentorship. She's mentored hundreds of critical undergraduate, master's, and doctoral students who are now teaching and working in schools, colleges, and organizations across the nation. Prior to her position at SFSU, she did her undergraduate work at UC Berkeley in ethnic studies, woo, alumni, and received her PhD from UCLA in education. In 2001, she founded Panay Educational Partnerships, or PEP, a barangay that provides ethnic studies courses and curriculum, develops radical educators, and creates resources for Filipino, Filipinx, and Filipino communities, and similarly marginalized people. She has worked with many educators, schools, and school districts throughout the nation to co-develop curriculum and frameworks that center pedagogies rooted in ethnic studies, social justice, wellness, artivism, praxis, solidarity, and humanization. She's also the co-founder and director of Community Responsive Education, a national firm that supports the development of responsive, equitable, and justice-driven educators. Dr. Tintiago-Cubales is also a producer for Larry the Musical and The Art of Work film, both premiering in 2024. She is the author of many books, articles, and essays focused on the applications of critical pedagogy, the ethnic studies curriculum, mother scholarship, and Panayism. She has also served as an editor and author for several anthologies and journals, such as At 40 Asian American Studies, the Journal of Asian American Studies, Asian American Pacific Islander Nexus, and co-editor for the Sage Encyclopedia of Filipina, Filipinx, and Filipino-American Studies, which some of our panelists are involved in as well, I hear. Allison is a loving partner to Val Tintiago-Cubales, a phenomenal teacher and leader, and the mother of Mahalaya, a prolific dancer and artist. So can we give a warm welcome to our panelists? But yeah, thank you all so much for being here. For those of you who aren't familiar, we're going to kick it off with some questions. We'll also open it up to the audience towards the end. These events are all recorded and turned into resource pages, so you can access all of the lessons, resources, as well as more beyond that afterwards. But I'm very excited to get started with all of y'all. And what better place to get started than the question of why are we here? There are countless entry points, as we all know, to introduce students to Philippine studies and Filipino-American history. For those of you who don't know, this month is also Filipino-American History Month. However, in spaces of grassroots political education, our community often starts with a simple question of why are we here? So reflecting on that, I wanted to ask you, how can teachers help Filipino students think critically about their place in the diaspora and the conditions of forced migration? Click on Vernadette first.
You flip the switch. Okay. So actually that question was a really generative question. I taught a class this past spring on Philippine US narratives of empire, and I had my students read excerpts from Carlos Bulosan, which I hadn't taught ever. And I figured I didn't want to teach the whole thing, but I wanted to teach some really key excerpts that depicted just the kind of circuits, right, that Bulosan was caught in as a laborer from the Philippines, all the way up and down the West Coast, and the modes of travel. And so the question was that I asked them when they came back to the classroom was, where is the Filipino? And I named all the places, you know, like we went through and named all the places that Bulasan's body traveled to. We thought about not just like the places he went to, but the nature of the mobility that he experienced, right? This is pretty precarious mobility. Students always were saying they felt it was dizzying. It was, they felt like the narrative was made them feel unsafe, right? Like they always thought something bad was going to happen, and so something bad always did, right? And so I think that was a really kind of generative question to start with, right? Where is the Filipino? And then you can move from where's the Filipino to why is the Filipino there, right? What are the conditions and structures and desires that facilitate the kind of mobility, right, that we're talking about? And that was just one example of Bulasan. We could talk about any other kind of example, but I wanted to start with a classic because he really sort of narrates that sort of the itinerary, right, of a migrant worker up and down California, and they would recognize their hometowns, or I know that place, right? And so there's a connection there, and then from there I think that you can go back to the students, right, and get them to think about, well, why are you here? What are your mobilities? Why are your mobilities the way they are? That's it.
All right, I think thinking about this question, I always kind of think about what was my introduction to like Filipinx studies. And for me, you know, I'm lucky to have a big brother that was in like movement spaces, right? Because my first introduction to Filipinx studies, you know, wasn't in a high school classroom, wasn't in a college classroom, but was in a workshop organized by a Nakbayan in Seattle, which was like a youth organization that connects kind of our civil rights, kind of like economic struggles in the US to things happening in the Philippines, right? So they would do this workshop called Philippine Society and Revolution, right? And without kind of like going into, you know, the details of it, you know, it really offered kind of this methodology that still like sticks with me today, right? In terms of, you know, placing our histories not just within a history of colonization, but a resistance to that, right? So a workshop that, you know, or at least a part of that workshop that I still use when I introduce the classes, we typically kind of do take like a timeline, right? In terms of, you know, kind of think about different places to start, right? But with some kind of these key moments in like Philippine history, right? And then, you know, after we kind of like go through these different dates, you know, asking students to really think about these dates in relationship to their family history, right? You know, even kind of questions of, you know, tracing like when they migrated, right? And connecting it to like a particular time period, right? And usually that would open up space where, you know, a lot of students like me, my family immigrated in the context of the US funded martial law regime in the Philippines, right? So it opened up a space to kind of have that conversation. You know, some students would kind of share stories of their family members, much like mine, are overseas Filipino workers, right? In terms of my uncle worked in the Middle East as a construction worker, my aunt worked in Japan as a domestic worker. You know, so being able to kind of place our lived experience in this historical continuum, you know, of not just oppression, but struggle, right? I think, to me, that's kind of the message, right, of Filipinx studies. And I'm just kind of appreciative of, I think, like movement spaces offer kind of, you know, I kind of lean towards the idea of like, you know, ethnic studies was a social movement practice that existed outside of the university, and when things like the TWF brought that practice into the university, right? So for me, like, and also just kind of be mindful of like teachers in the room too. You know, I want to kind of think of like resources that we could offer too. And I want to lift up, I don't know if anyone's seen this timeline created by Soya Jung. Soya Jung is part of this organization called Change Lab, which is kind of a movement-based like research lab that strategically kind of looks at kind of Asian American communities in the context of like racial justice struggles, right? So they created what they call like a different Asian American timeline, right? And the timeline isn't just thinking about kind of these important moments, right? But actually kind of thinking about, it kind of makes the argument that, US history is defined by enslavement and racial capitalism, dispossession of land and settler colonialism, and US militarism, right? So using kind of those three like racializing logic and kind of tracking that through history, it places, encourages us to kind of think about Asian American history along those lines, right? So the timeline really stretches from like the 1400s to the present, right? But something that I do in terms of, say, when I teach Filipinx-American studies or Filipinx Diaspora studies, I'm kind of, I think historically, so I kind of like organize it chronologically sometimes, right? So one of the units is like 1898 to 1934, right? In the context of kind of thinking about this like, particular kind of period of like US colonial administration of the Philippines and how that maps onto like, Filipinx bodies in the United States, right? And something the timeline does is like, say, 1898 is, Spanish-American War, Filipinx-American War, but then also the Curtis Act happens, right? In terms of folks are familiar with the Dawes Act, in terms of when, US policy really led to massive land dispossession. Like the Curtis Act continued that process for certain nations that weren't initially included in the Dawes Act, right? So in terms of being able to place, say, the Filipino-American War and kind of these continued processes of like indigenous dispossession, like together, right? I think also like that's, another part of kind of thinking about like why we're here. And like, actually, I think part of one aspect, that, I really think is important is thinking about the politics of diaspora, right? And thinking about kind of the consciousness, right? Of kind of linking our struggles at home and our struggles here and our struggles back home, right? But also thinking about our relationship to struggles here, right? Really having, I think for me, a defining feature of Filipinx history is actually solidarity in multiple stretches, from intergenerational solidarity, multiracial solidarity, transnational solidarity, right? So yeah, I think for me, like those are really the anchors that I try to hold.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. I am already thrilled to kind of learn from my two colleagues here. I think it starts with learning for me. I was in Dwinell 145. Y'all know where that is? Big old room, my very first class at Berkeley. I was a little different than the other students. Lots of attitude. Little guy in the front, skinny, tiny, smiling. Salt and pepper Bob with like kind of feathered hair, big black glasses, Japanese American. And he was like, in this class, we're going to learn about Asian American epistemologies. And I looked around, I was like, does everybody else know what that word was? I was like, what? I was very confused and wondering what the heck is this guy talking about? And I think he read my mind because he was like, before you ask me what it is, it's how you know what you know. Or how you think you know what you know. And in his book, Strangers from a Different Shore, hardback, by the way, everybody, still with the, like the paper cover on top, in my Bay Area P9 writing, I wrote the definition that he said of epistemology over and over again. How you know what you know. How you know what you know. How you know what you know. And then I realized after writing it over and over again, I didn't. know how I knew. I knew. I mean, that was Ron Takaki. For those of you, the late Ron Takaki. I just wrote this piece recently and talked about that story. This is very new for me to return back to that moment. Because when you think of your early moment, you're thinking of organizing, I'm thinking of the same thing. But actually, for me, there was this really interesting moment here on campus. Because I was a transfer student from a community college called Ohlone Community College.
Yeah.
Right? Ohlone in the house. Right? Yeah, you always, I love that. I love that. Represent Ohlone. And I was really uncomfortable here at Berkeley. But I remember when he was describing this big word epistemology, and I kept writing the definition because I was actually thinking, you like write the definitions in different places and just try to remember them. I think for me, I was trying to internalize that I had one. But do I have an epistemology? I think when working specifically, not just with Filipino students at the high school level, but all students of color and all students, there's this feeling like they need to be able to understand that they matter, that they have an identity, that they have a story. All of those things are necessary for them to then listen to our stories that we're trying to tell them. So I always start, like when we're talking about why we're here, I have students really trace, like, how did you get here? Not just how did you physically get here? How did you get to Berkeley? I worked hard, I took all my, but like, no, really, how did you get here? Like, who are your parents? Who are your grandparents? Like, what are some of the experiences, good and bad, that brought you here? Like, so important, because I think, although like I want to give them all these books that I had read that inspired me, I think before I get there, which is definitely America's in the Heart, was like the first book that my community college professor gave me. I want students to be able to know that when they engage it, like you said, like, then what is your story? Like, like, how do you connect to that? So stories is a big thing. Filipino-American History Month, Filipinx, Filipino-American History Month is, to me, really about stories. I think we like to celebrate it with all kinds of fun stuff like the food. Oh, I love the food. I feel like it's also really important that we remember that history is based on stories, that research and data is based on stories. And so that's where I start.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's deeply resonant, especially as we consider the moment we're in now, the space that we're in now, all the questions that our community is contending with now, right now, in this political moment. And yeah, also as someone whose first entry into Filipino history at all being PSR, that was also very resonant, Michael. But yeah, as Filipino Americans, we also know too that we're all too familiar with how labor exploitation is central to the political situation, both in the homeland as well as, the mass struggles of our colorblind here in the US. Vernadette, you talking about Carlos Blosan, how you teach his story in your class. And then also, just acknowledging the material situation of our people, that a majority of Filipino society consists of landless peasants and workers. Our people are the Philippines' #1 export, with thousands leaving for overseas work every day. And that's still the moment that we're in. So I wanted to ask you all, how does the issue of labor shape your approach to teaching Filipino studies, and how can educators ground their curriculum and pedagogy in the ongoing issues of labor exploitation that Filipino workers around the world face?
I can take this up. I got a lot to say about labor. I don't know. I think for me, like, labor is how I entered Filipino-American studies too, just because that's what makes sense to me. Like, in terms of like my family of workers, like a lot of times folks think of like the Alaska cannery experience in Filipino-American history as this like Carlos Blosan, like, in terms of when my family immigrated in the 1980s, like at least 1 to 3 family members working in Canada, right? It still was like a continued like source of labor, right? And I think about this a lot because I remember, as a professor, like I'm in front of a computer a lot, so like my back was hurting. One time, like my grandma was like, right, and she was just telling me stories of like when you're working cleaning the fish or cleaning like the crabs, like if the machine doesn't get all the shell off, you have to peel it yourself, right? So she was just telling stories of like her fingers would be bleeding, she just had to kind of keep on going. Like about these kind of extractive industries, right? In terms of as, products are coming in, so they don't spoil, like you have to work long hours, right? So in terms of for me, like that's how I kind of make sense of Filipinx-American history on some level, right? In the context of it is kind of this like material relationship to labor, right? And I mean, like not only that, right? But also like I also think about like going back to stories, right? In terms of my family also kind of, in addition to telling those kind of stories of like being on the shop floor, they also kind of tell the stories of all the things they do when they're not a child, like, in terms of, I won't like go into that because film, but I think that's also like if, telling our stories is what, like, as a message or as it says, right? In terms of, I think that's also part of it, right? In terms of, I think there's a way in which we think of like a way in which like oppression could just like dominate, and sometimes forget that like even in that people are living, people are finding, different ways to find meaning in life, right? Great life. But at the same time, like I also like for me, I really kind of sit with, it's kind of the defining like industries of like Philippine labor migration, at least like pre-1960 is the cannery, the Hawaiian like sugarcane plantation, pineapple plantation, and like California agribusiness, right? Those are also like entries into actually having all the type of conversations ethnic studies should be having, right? These are all industries that were products of, settler colonial economies, right? In the context of like, as migrant laborers with liminal rights, we produce massive profits in industries that were shaped by indigenous dispossession, right? As industries, all of them had like multiracial workforces, right? And in that context, our people have to kind of think about what does solidarity look like, right? And even kind of the uneven kind of ways that plays out, right? Also, like in terms of kind of thinking about resources, like I just kind of lift this up as an easy read. In terms of just lifting up my mom in terms of Philip Veracruz, I think it's in addition to like I always read it as like powerful compliment, Americans in the heart, right? Which I think doesn't get it, in terms of really like understanding Philip Veracruz's radicalism, like it doesn't get that with a lot, right?
Yeah.
And in terms of, I've been thinking about this more just because, my own research is on kind of like Filipinx-American activism during, the US Marcos dictatorship, right? And a chapter, like one of the latter chapters in this book, was like ominous tone, in fact. But one of the latter chapters of the book is Philip Veracruz talks about Cesar Chavez being invited to the Philippines by Marcos. A lot of times when I share this story in terms of my father-in-law is like a union organizer from like, he was involved in the SEIU, like in like the late 70s and 80s. And when I shared the story of, he was like a UFW supporter back in the day, right? But in terms of when I shared the story of, Cesar Chavez going to the Philippines, being wined and dined by Marcos, like he was shocked, right? And I think it's not necessarily to like blame, right? In terms of kind of, it's not as a way to kind of bash Cesar Chavez, but also kind of, I think these are complexities that we have to kind of sit with if we really like want us to kind of think deeply about, if say like Filipinx-American history is fine feature related solidarity, right? Because also I think something that, I try to kind of get my students to sit with is, so the radical kind of organization of like the 1970s and 1980s in the Filipino-American communities, the Katipunan ng mga Demokratikong Pilipinas or New Democratic Filipinos, they're, their newspaper like covered this extensively, right? So I bring kind of those stories in, right? And there's a KDP leader called Renee Cruz. I want to get this quote right, so I'm gonna read it. But one of the things that like the newspaper for the KDP published Renee Cruz's letter to Cesar Chavez, right? And one of the things that he said was, let's see, he, Marcos, has far more in common with the big growers of the Central Valley or Del Monte corporations than farm workers anywhere, right? So in terms of like really kind of getting this to like what I tell students to kind of think about, right? In terms of, you know, in these moments of like, quote unquote, like conflict or tension, you know, really kind of thinking about how these are moments where like folks are struggling with ideas, right? And in terms of they were really pushing, you know, the UFW, at least kind of the KDP was pushing the UFW to really kind of think about the problems of when they were also doing, you know, it's funny because he mentioned Del Monte. Like I think if like folks drive through Monterey, you know, in Monterey, like you'll see like streets named Del Monte, right? Del Monte is kind of like a corporation that is kind of rooted in kind of the history of like California agribusiness, like did a lot of kind of packing, right? But in the 1920s, you really see them like setting up operations in the Philippines, right? And this was like intensified during Marcos, right? Where corporations like Del Monte, California, or corporations like Castle and Cook, if anyone's from Hawaii, you might know Castle and Cook, right? These companies extend their operations to the Philippines. These are like multinational corporations are dispossessing independent farmers, turning them into like migrant workers, setting up these like brutal labor plantations, right? You know, so in terms of, I say all this to say, you know, I think for me, you know, sometimes like we're afraid to kind of think about kind of these histories, you know, of like, you know, we could say kind of conflict, right? But in terms of, I think if we want, and sometimes that fear like leads to flagging forms of resistance and not having deeper kind of conversations, right? So I really, you know, like lovingly push my students, let's deal with these contradiction. Let's think about like how these kind of play out in our own kind of moments, right? I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I'm just stopping. Yeah.
So since you covered so much of like the farm workers and the countering movements, I want to focus on gender and labor, right? Because I think that a lot of the times the labor of women, the gendered labor of care drops out of the picture, right? And in the contemporary moment, it is care labor, it's nurses, it's folks coming in from the Philippines to teach classes here. It's folks coming in from the Philippines to take care of America's elderly, right? That aren't necessarily sort of seen in that framework, and there's definitely a connection, right? But the other kind of care, I mean, I'm currently kind of thinking about the ways in which that care work is operationalized through militarism and tourism, right? Through entertainment, through more illegitimate kinds of care labor that might be like sex work, right? So I think about that in a whole gamut, and think about like the ways in which sometimes when we operate with a particular kind of understanding of who that Filipino laborer is, we sometimes will miss some really other important kinds of labor that are also sort of, you know, this society is absolutely reliant upon. I taught a class, I taught the same class last semester. It was like one of my first semesters teaching here at Berkeley. I really wanted to get my students to understand the pervasiveness of this care work, right? Like how it actually also evacuates people from the Philippines so that they're caring for people and elderly folks and other people elsewhere while nobody is caring for their own parents, right? Their own children back in the Philippines. So I taught this this documentary called Paper Dolls. I don't know if anyone has seen it. So it is basically a documentary, and it's like not like a pretty documentary. It's not like a straightforward one, which is I think what makes it very teachable, because I think students will find flaws in it, and that's where they can kind of hook onto and find a place for critique. But it's essentially a story of a few trans queer men, women, gender non-conforming folks, right? Who who are sort of, some of them are documented, some of them are undocumented, who go to Israel, right, to provide care work for elderly Jewish men. And so the sort of contours, right, of the structure, the conditions that create this sort of importation of labor, and then the ways in which they sort of navigate the spaces of Israel as like queer folk, right, in a pretty orthodox society. Like some of the folks are like looking at them like, wait, where are you? And then on the weekends they have like a drag review, which is really amazing, right? And so, you know, it speaks to, you know, it's a story about queer life and joy, but also like the unrelenting kind of pressures of labor and racial exploitation, right? So I think that that's like a really interesting kind of way to get into questions of gender, questions of who gets to care for whom, right? And why is that? And I think, of course, the most recent, you know, the pandemic, right? And how Filipino nurses were at the front lines, right, of that pandemic, how they were the most vulnerable folks. And then the narrative that we hear is like, these are the heroes. And we're doing this, you know, like we're good at this. We're good at being nurses because Filipinos are caring, which is also like some kind of interesting narratives to kind of deconstruct, right, with students, because I showed them this like frontline documentary, right, about Filipino nurses and how like they were the first to die, right, because they're out there with no protection, right, and they were working extra hours, they were vulnerable as workers, and folks were dying, and then the narrative like tries to recuperate that, tries to recuperate those deaths by you know, making them into heroes rather than talking about the kinds of working conditions that render these folks incredibly vulnerable, right? And it's also then a story about labor organizing, because like the firm that was exploiting them, you know, like they organized it around it. But it's something to think about, right? Like in terms of I think it's really important to couple the question of labor to that of gender.
Mhm. I love the transitioning here, going from farm worker labor to care labor. I want to talk about hip hop dance as labor.
Yeah, let's do that.
And very much, this was a labor of love. Well, labor of love for me. So I have different projects. This is the one very unpaid project. Was to work with hip hop dancers for the last 3 years. Famous hip hop dancers. One of them choreographed for BTS. Yes, and I've been meaning to write about this, but it's more of something I wanted to contribute. There is a hip hop dancer named Cruz. He was the one who started the company here in the Bay Area and also the Kinjas in LA. Anybody familiar with them? Okay, ABDC, World of Dance. Okay, so these are people that I happen to be in contact with because one of them was not one of them, all of them were actually one of my daughter's dance teachers. They wanted to write a grant. This is how it started. And I was like, okay, this grant specifically was asking like what are the key things you all want to talk about? And they said, okay, we want to like learn about Filipino-American stuff. So what's interesting about it is it's a group of pretty famous hip hop dancers who've never taken ethnic studies. Some of them did not go to college, but you know, people look up to them. And they create these beautiful orchestrated pieces, dancing in, you know, places like Zellerbach and, you know, like, and so I just was like enamored by the group. And then I'm like, okay, so how can we make this meaningful? So we created a project called Art of Work.
And it's now filmed. So, and the film is a creative piece, not a documentary. I think at some point we got to do the documentary. But this idea of art of work, and I introduce it to them as 3 conversations. The first conversation is historical labor as work, right? Like understanding all the stuff that you were talking about, Michael, and then also adding theory to it. Like, what's the difference between labor and work? You know, what are the different kinds of shifts of labor, talking about gender and the shifts of labor. So we were getting into it, lots of tears in these conversations. And then the second conversation was counter storytelling and healing as work. Like, what are some of the things that they had to do, quite literally, physically, and then also emotionally, to be able to do the work as these phenomenal hip hop dancers. And then the third conversation was dance and art as work. And it was such a beautiful process with them. They got to read America's in the Heart. That was their first text that they read. They read Journey for Justice. They read Little Manila's in the Heart. They read Labor, what's Valerie's book? Oh my gosh, Labor of Care. Oh my gosh, I forgot the title. And we were really trying to have them understand. That's the first phase, was just learning. And then I had them interview a family member about their labor. And then they got to dance to the voices of their family members. Beautiful, beautiful work. And so then all of that sort of informed this larger project called Art of Work, the film. It's a short film, it's about 30 minutes. And it's this journey of a dancer who experiences failure and then ends with failure. You know, I think sometimes we hope they audition and get the gig, but sometimes they don't. And so it's also that understanding that labor is something that you're continually trying to understand, even the painful stuff. So it's on the film festival circuit. We're probably going to put it on YouTube next year. It's been at different festivals like Cam Festival and but yeah, so Art of Work. Check it out.
Thank you. So thank you so much. I couldn't have asked for a better way that all these narratives are threading together. You know, Michael, you talking about why is it that generation after generation from the Philippines to the US, the destinies of our people, the majority of whom are laborers, have to be controlled by you know, big companies whose and dictators like that of Marcos and you know, Vernadette, you speaking to you know, this really cruel and sick and twisted disparity between Filipino nurses being in the single-digit percentages of the nurses in California, but a third of the deaths from COVID. And I really love, Allison, how you brought it back to, you know, the space of the ways that cultural work, cultural education can be a place for us to think beyond those restrictions, those limits, those systems. Which is what brings me to my final point before hopefully we turn it over to the audience. So in the last 20 minutes, you all would be down to discuss about, you know, about education, about like, you know, education as such a liberatory space and recognizing that, you know, like from the colonial period to now, from the homeland to here where we are in the belly of the beast, teaching this history in a way that is deep, in a way that takes multiple forms. But teaching that history that criticizes the systems of imperialism, the systems of capitalism, they're often met with state violence, with counterinsurgency, or with co-optation. Is really, you know, the moment that we're living in, but the way that, you know, education has been responded to, this type of education has been responded to for as long as Filipinos have been here and for as long as Filipinos have organized, which as we know has been forever. So I wanted to present the question to you, you know, what are the challenges that you have encountered teaching a liberated, a pro-people model of Filipino-American studies, and how can we all also, because we know it's a collective effort, organize to uphold this liberated pro-people model of Filipino-American studies?
So I moved here from Hawaii, and that was one of the first things I saw was like on my Facebook was Allison getting attacked, and I was like, oh, yay! There's a place for Filipinas in California. I could be right at home here.
No, I mean, like, maybe I'm a bit more like I toggle between being a complete cynic and knowing like, oh yeah, no, they're coming for you. They've always been, and especially if you've done work around Palestine. I have a lot of friends who do stuff around critical Zionist studies, and they've just been at the crosshairs forever, right? And so when we I think in Filipino studies we don't always teach about Palestine. Right, but I think in this moment we must, right? I just wrote some notes about this down because I've been thinking about like the way in which our universities have the university system at UC in particular has really organized over the summer following the encampments, right? And really sort of created a pretty carceral, sort of like reinforced the carceral institution that the university already is. So I think we have to remember that our institutions are wedded to the state, that our state is a war machine, right? We cannot lose sight of that. And therefore our institutions are also a critical part of the war machine. So we're living in a war machine, right? And so we have the struggles coming from inside, the calls coming from inside the house. And the Philippines, right, when we think about it, has been, continues to be a critical hub of that war machine, right? In terms of the location of the archipelago, the personnel that it provides to that war machine, the political cover and the alliances, right? So if you're thinking about sort of larger geopolitical relations, the present moment, right, just here, the donations and support from the Philippine state to our students and institutions, is kind of a form of recognition that we cannot afford. We cannot afford that form of recognition, right? And Palestine, of course, right? Even as I just got this email from our chancellor, I guess, provost. I don't know. I'm new here. So even as UC Berkeley supposedly celebrates its 60th anniversary, right, of the free speech movement. Like I got this email, whoa, free speech movement. We see controls, right, being constructed around speech and the teaching of settler colonialism specifically, right? The critiques of Israel, genocide studies that include Israel and the United States as primary purveyors and users of weapons of mass destruction, right? That's not free speech, right? And I have to also say that in this moment, I think our students are leading us. We're not the ones at the forefront, right? Our students are the ones who are often leading us in this moment. And our job, I think, as teachers, as researchers, as scholars, is to provide them with intellectual cover, right? So this means that we need to produce legitimate, rigorous scholarship so that the material is there for them, right? The methods are rigorous. And we need to provide them political cover, right? With our solidarity, with our presence, with our support in whatever way that they need. So I'll just.
I was thinking about this from like I'm a professor in CSU context, right? So in terms of what do they call it? The time, place,
Manner.
time, place. So in terms of there's a new policy that's directly targeting like encampment, right? But I don't know, like I think about my own kind of like trajectory where I've gotten jobs, and I think it's seen kind of like I think I'm just kind of thinking about kind of students leading the way, just kind of being blessed to be able to like be kind of like hired in the aftermath of kind of this repression, right? But in terms of also being like, also kind of understanding that these are also like moments of like dynamic student organizing, right? In the context of my first job after like getting out of UC Berkeley was actually at SF State at a lecture, right? And it was in the aftermath of like the student hunger strike that saved the College of Ethnic Studies, right? Where you actually had, one of my students was one of the hunger strikers, right? I think, after that, I got a job at Western Washington University, which it's in Bellingham, Washington. It's like over 80% white city, you know what I mean? But a little kind of context to like one of Trump's first rallies when he ran was like in the city right next to Vicuña. So that was kind of the context of it. And then one of my first welcomes to the university was getting my emails FOIA by like this right-wing organization that basically targeted all ethnic studies and social justice organization or like departments and faculty, right? You know, and just kind of in that context, you know, just having to have like serious kind of conversations about like, you know, safety, you know, safety for us, safety for my kids, like literally me and my partner actually had a conversation like, yeah, we're gonna send some goes down, we're gonna send kids to grandma, you know. But also like, you know, that space was also you know, it was a vibrant space of like student organizing, right? And I think just kind of, I think Allison kind of like your story is like really brought back to the fact that you know, the way that the community like rallies around like our right to this education, that's ethnic study. In terms of what's in the classroom is like important, and it's like it's a tool to get to kind of that space, right? You know, so I think one of my friends would talk about how the best way to defend ethnic studies is to like constantly practice it, right? You know, and I think just kind of thinking of how the community of Berkeley High rallied around, you know, a teacher that was kind of being like removed from his classroom for actually like holding the space for kind of like having conversations about Palestine liberation, right? And just thinking about everyone that showed up in terms of, you know, he was teaching there for over 20 plus years, just like all the networks that were created through doing kind of the community-based like ethnic studies education showed up, and that's like, that was what ethnic studies, that's what Filipinx studies, you know, is like creating kind of those spaces, you know? So yeah, no, I think just kind of like that doesn't change the fact that the oppression is happening, right? But also, as someone who studies social movements too, like I understand that repression is actually a tool to like, you know, divert our energy away from the work that we're meant to do, right? That's, I think, part of actually kind of naming that its purpose is to like, you know, say move us away from, put our energy towards defending ourselves instead of like, you know, putting our energy into the work that ethnic studies calls us to do. And I think having that as part of our conversation, part of our analysis, you know, as this is happening, I think is important.
Thank you all so much. Yeah, just so much for us, I think, to reflect on. I know that there's students, there's instructors, there's graduate students, faculty, staff, family members, friends, community members here, and all of these are so deeply resonant. It reminds me of something that one of my mentors told me, which is when activists in the Philippines are facing red tagging, which is a tactic of counterinsurgency by the government to label people demanding rights as terrorists, that the most effective deterrent for red tagging is to be rooted in the community. Because if you're rooted in the community, if you're doing work, if you're supporting them, if you're actually interested in the issues that are affecting them, then when you face attacks, they will come for you, they will have your back, kind of like Allison was saying. So I really appreciate that. So we're very fortunate in the last bit of time that we have together. We have about 15 minutes to turn it over to the audience. I was wondering maybe, yeah, so Victoria could run the mic for us. Does anyone in the room here have any questions for our panelists?
Hi. Hello. Yeah, thank you all so much for speaking. I really appreciated hearing like everything you had to say about like Philippines and ethnic studies and like different types of labor also. And I'm just thinking about how recently I became aware that there's going to be a Philippine Studies program at UC Berkeley, but it's funded by the Philippine government through the consulate. So 18 million pesos, sorry, 1 million pesos, but it's equivalent to $18,000 is going sorry, wait, was this talked about before I got here?
No,
I'm
no.
kidding. Oh, sorry, no, everyone's looking at each other, I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, wait. But I'm just, yeah, I actually like have some Zooms with me from the League of Filipino Students about like, our thoughts about this, about how this is like rooted in this imperialist idea of area studies and Philippine studies from like a US colonial lens. And also just thinking how like this money is going through like the chair of the Southeast Asian Studies here, Dr. Leosandro Claudio, who's a known red tagger, and how like, that makes a lot of us as Filipino students feel unsafe. And this is also coming after like this history of students who have been organizing to create a pro-people Philippine studies program. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, what are your thoughts about this, and what do you think we can do as a community to ensure that like that we're not going to have this Philippine studies in to work against this? Sorry.
I could jump in. I think all your critiques of it are right. Like I don't in terms of just kind of like naming that. I think Amy, I think like funding is always a hard thing, right? Because like I think the defining part of an ethnic study, like as an institutionalized like part, right, is a struggle for funding, right? But when that funding, is linked to political compromise, right? That's something that really has to, we have to kind of think about. And I think like all I'd say is in terms of, I think of the history of our own department here on campus in terms of ethnic studies. Like, I think if you like study the history, co-optation like happened immediately. You know what I mean? In terms of it's kind of a slow process, but I think you have to, there's so many history about that I'm like, I just think you have to like, students always kind of lead the way of what I think they should be. And I think, yeah, I think there has to be, students will kind of lead our understanding or analysis of what that, what a pro-people Philippine studies should look like.
Thank you for bringing it up. We were actually talking about it before the thing started. I don't know, I was just informed about what's happening. I'm the advisor of LFS at San Francisco State for many, many years. I should already tell you where I'm standing on this. I do think it's good to learn how to ask the right questions from the right people. I don't know exactly what has been done already, so I don't want to assume that you haven't done this. But I think a few things. One, when we were fighting for ethnic studies on this campus, I mean, we took over California Hall. Not that you should do that, but like, it's a little, maybe a little harder, but taking a stand on things, especially with time, place, manner, I'm sure it's harder, but I mean, taking a stand is really key. I love that you did a zine. Has there been letters already sent, to people who have the power to make decisions here? Because that might be one, right? Asking the right kinds of questions about like the funding, and then also saying, and I'm not sure you want to go down this road, but if you are going to fund it through that, can we make sure that these things get covered in the curriculum? Anti-martial law, right? Pro-people, and actually list out for them the things that, like that you would want to learn in a Philippine or a critical Filipinx studies program. I'm not an area studies person at all. I'm definitely rooted in ethnic studies as my framework. And so I would start to also study some of the ethnic studies framing and create some questions about what the curriculum may become through an ethnic studies framework. Yeah, I feel like I don't know enough to like actually give like concrete advice, but those are some of the ways I would approach it. And then I don't know about the faculty member, you know, like, have you all had conversations with him before about, you know, what's happening? Or maybe he's not approachable, that's okay too, to say that no. But then there are also other faculty in this room right now who are Filipino, you know, like who might be helpful in the conversation. Yeah, okay. As to the faculty member.
Yeah, so my big piece of advice to students who are like, oh, you know, this institution doesn't have a place for me. The institution is never gonna love you. Let's start there, right? The people who are gonna love you are the other people like you, right? The other students, the teachers. So build something there. The money, yes, the money is gonna go there, but what happens to that money if nobody takes those classes? What happens to that money if nobody decides to take it? Like, what's it gonna do, right? Can you build something else instead? Can you build, you know, with the vision that you have? Can we crowdfund in our communities to build something else that's a Philippine X studies, right? Like a critical Filipino-American studies, a critical Philippine pro labor, pro LGBTQ, pro everything, right? In terms of like an alternative kind of structure, right? And it can be in the university or it cannot be, right? The best things that have ever sort of like been taken by this university started from outside, but it's usually been started by students and it's usually been rooted in the community, right? So don't think that just because something got funded that it's like the best thing, it's the shiniest new thing on the block, but it's legitimate. Because you have the power to legitimize or delegitimize it by your presence, by your vote, by not showing up to classes, right? So that's also like a really kind of, that's power that's in your hands. And if you have a particular kind of critique of something, right? It's just like blood money, maybe, right? Then do something else. Choose, you know, there's like sort of battles you can fight and battles you can take elsewhere, right? So we all have like a finite amount of energy. So are you gonna fight that battle? Are you gonna build something else? Is, you know, and you can do both, right? But you know, strategize, because I think that there's lots of options aside from thinking that Philippine studies can only happen in a center that's funded by this money.
Maybe just one little additional thing is we have now learned a lot more about divestment. And so maybe studying divestment, you know, that we have experienced, I mean, that we have been pushing, you know, like, by the way, the BDS movement didn't start on October 7th. It's been going on for a very, very long time, right?
Yeah.
So like what has been done and how did they do it? And how did they get so many people? Because it's not gonna just be enough to get Filipinos to address this. We need people to be in solidarity with us to be able to get our voices heard. And divestment is not an easy feat. So how do we get more people involved in just understanding how people got divestment at particular universities, including SF State?
And it looks like we have a question on Zoom.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, so the question is, and thank you very much personally for everything, but I wanted to read the question. Granted the breadth and depth of what Filipinx studies is, how can we tailor the curriculum to fit a semester course versus year-long course while still keeping true to the intent and integrity of the course?
I think there were maybe some audio issues, so just to reiterate the question was, given the breadth and depth of Philippine studies, how can we fit it into a semester long or year long, in some cases, courses, while also keeping true to the original, intent and roots of Filipino studies.
Can we just type in a clarification question? Like, are we talking about a high school course, an ethnic studies high school course, and how to include a unit on Filipino-American studies, or create course on Filipino-American, very, very different
Yeah.
to answer, you know? Like if you're gonna actually create a Filipino-American studies course, it's lots of flexibility to do that in one semester. But if it's just one unit in the ethnic studies course that's gonna be fulfilling the requirement, you really have to be choosy about what you teach. And part of that means, I mean, I would focus on the history of labor as the major starting point in that discussion. Specifically, I know that we kind of focused on that here, but the things that both, both of my colleagues like mentioned, like that's a good sort of starting point. We do have a unit, there's 2 units on Filipinos in the UCLA book. One is on Filipinos in general, and it's a 5-week unit with the readings and multimedia. So that should be coming out very soon. And they used all of the resources from the Smithsonian. So Theo Gonzalez is one of the ones who wrote that up. The other one to consider is the Filipino Farm Workers Unit that's in UCLA's book. Also it's roughly a 5-week unit. You can narrow it down to shorter than that. And then we also have multimedia, and then we also wrote it together using the work of Don Babalon, Rudy Guevara, Gail Roma Santa, Mark Polito wrote Philip Veracruz's part, and then Stacy Salinas wrote the Filipinas in the farm worker movement part. So there's a lot of resources. You have to make choices, and I would focus on not just labor in what we experience, but the resistance and the movements against the repression around the labor. Yeah. We have a lot of resources. Also, AB 123, when we fought for AB 123 to get that in the high school curriculum, there's also resources at the state level.
Okay, can you hear me? Good. So to clarify, yes, we currently have an ethnic studies class. It is a semester course that our district is exploring, an upper class selected, just focusing on Filipinx studies, which, depending on interest, could be semester or year long. And then a related question, what book are you referring to from UCLA?
So that's actually a good one. Well, now I have 2 resources. One is the UCLA one, actually 3 resources. The UCLA one is called Futures and Foundations and Futures, and the focus is an open source textbook for Asian American and Pacific Islander studies. And it's pretty robust. The first 6 chapters is coming out, I think, in December, and it will be online, and you can access it through UCLA's website. I mean, we tried to really get a bunch of different scholars who write about these topics, actually write about the topic, but more for the audience that is like between 7th grade to 12th grade. And then the lesson plans, I'm the curriculum director, so all the lesson plans were created specifically from teachers. I mean, which is really cool. So they took the scholars' writing and then created lessons based on that. So you'll get access to that. The other resource is the Filipino-American, the Sage Encyclopedia of Filipino-American Studies that I was honored to work with Kevin Nadal and E.J.R. David to, and you actually have some in there, some entries. And there's 350 entries on Filipino-Filipinx American Studies, 350 entries. Growing up, we didn't have that. We had those ugly burgundy or whatever with the gold. What were those called? Funkin' Wagnalls? Funkin' Wagnalls Encyclopedia. Anyways, and then the only entry we had was like Philippines, the Republic of. And this whole encyclopedia is honestly, it was a counter-hegemonic project. We were just trying to get as much in there. So please use that as a resource. Most libraries have it now, but if your library doesn't, please have your library buy it. Or buy a set for your classroom. So those are 2 resources. I'm sure there's more.
I also never feel like I have to be comprehensive in terms of coverage because it's impossible, right? To do everything in one semester or everything in a year even, right? So what I try to focus on when I'm designing a class for students is what are the concepts I want them to leave with? Because the concepts are portable. Like you can use those as critical analytical lenses with which to approach any set of materials, whether it's a novel, a film, right, archives. I also think that you can really engage the students themselves in the production of the material, right? Producing a zine, for instance, right? And then having that zine the next year be the material. Like actually this happened in my class. I was like so impressed with the materials my students produced in my Filipino-X narratives class that I'm like, so can I take this and assign it for my next time I teach this class? Because it was so good, right? Like the critical material they produced was so good that I was like, I'd rather teach this than something else, right? Because the students themselves were really producing that work. So I think that there's a way in which you can actually also turn the opportunity of teaching into the students becoming owners of the knowledge, producers of the knowledge themselves.
Any last thoughts? You wanna think this out?
Hi, oh, just to follow up, so yeah, we haven't met to ask for transparency around some of our questions yet, but that is something that we're like planning to do. But right now, we're just in like the early stages of like, you know, using POM with like Filipino-American History Month to get other like Filipino students looped in, because we really ideally want this to be a campaign reached across other Filipino orgs too, like not just all of us. And yeah, we were asking for like more transparency since like there really is such limited information out right now. And I can show you all the zine or if anyone like wants it, I have a bunch, but it's really just like providing context. But yeah, thank you so much for your advice, and actually like I'd love to meet with y'all later to talk about some of these ideas.
Yeah, thank you so much. I know also that, you know, we're seeing this interplay between questions from building at the high school level to the university level to even outside of these institutions. So I appreciate that. Did y'all have any last notes in response to these questions? I just want to be mindful of y'all's time and the interns' time, but would you be willing to also perhaps dialogue with our community members afterwards after we close out? I want to, yeah, definitely have that dialogue and continue it. Yeah, thank you so much. Can we give a round of applause for our panel? We really appreciate you all for your time. We know that it's a busy month with POM, but I really hope that we all, you know, take to heart the different lessons, the ways that we win through organizing, the ways that, you know, the resilience of our community, the deep knowledge that we have through, yes, like long legacies of oppression, but also long legacies of resistance. I also want to shout out if you want to continue these conversations, League of Filipino Students has a student taught class from 6 to 8 on Thursdays in Dwinell 206. So if anyone wants to continue those conversations. But yes, there's food in the back, and like we said, all of these resources will be compiled into a resource page. The recording will be available afterwards. And yes, we're always welcome as the High School Ethnic Studies Initiative, History Social Science Project, AC, and the Ethnic Studies Department to have dialogue with folks who are interested in our work, see, you know, how we can provide and best meet the needs of high school teachers at this critical moment, and then wider community members who are interested in these lessons about community-based education. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Clara.